June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. The first Sherman tanks rolled off the landing craft into chest-deep water, steel beasts groaning under their own weight, salt spray lashing against armor plating still warm from the crossing. The crews could hear nothing but the roar of naval guns overhead and the metallic screech of treads finding purchase on submerged obstacles. Some tanks made it to the beach. Others didn't. The water swallowed them whole, their crews trapped inside iron coffins filling with seawater in seconds. But the tanks that reached the sand faced something worse than drowning. The hedgerows. No American planner had understood what those two words really meant. Intelligence reports mentioned them, certainly. Ancient earthen walls topped with dense vegetation, dividing the Norman countryside into a patchwork of small fields. Farm boundaries that had stood since Roman times. The reports made them sound quaint, pastoral, a minor tactical consideration at most. The men of the 2nd Armored Division learned the truth within hours of pushing inland. The hedgerows weren't walls. They weren't obstacles. They were fortresses. Each one stood 10 to 15 feet high, roots twisted into packed earth hard as concrete, crowned with hawthorn and oak trees grown so thick together that sunlight barely penetrated. Centuries of growth compressed into barriers that turned every Norman field into a killing box 30 yards wide. The Germans had recognized this immediately. They'd transformed these ancient boundaries into the most effective defensive network the war had yet seen. Staff Sergeant Curtis Cullen sat in the commander's hatch of his M4 Sherman, studying the hedgerow 50 yards ahead. His tank, christened My Buddy by his crew, idled at the edge of a field still scarred by morning's artillery barrage. Smoke drifted across trampled wheat. The air tasted like cordite and wet earth. Cullen was 23 years old, a New Jersey kid who'd worked in his father's garage before the war. He understood engines, transmissions, the logic of metal under stress. He'd been in France for 8 days. In those 8 days, he'd watched American armor attempt the same maneuver 17 times. The tactic never changed. Tank approaches hedgerow. Tank tilts upward to climb the earthen wall. Tank exposes its thin belly armor at a 45-degree angle. German gunner, positioned in the next field with a clear line of sight, places a single 75mm round into the exposed underside. Tank explodes. Crew dies. Next tank moves forward and repeats the process. 17 times in 8 days. "Sarge, we gonna try climbing that thing?" Private Miller asked from the driver's position. His voice carried that particular tension of a man who'd already seen too many burning Shermans. Cullen didn't answer immediately. He was watching something else. 50 yards to their left, a different kind of vehicle had stopped at the field's edge. Not a tank, a bulldozer. One of the engineering dozers that followed the combat units, clearing rubble, filling craters, making roads passable. Its blade was lowered, scraping at the base of a hedgerow while engineers discussed something Cullen couldn't hear. The dozer blade bit into the ancient earthwork. Not climbing. Cutting. Something clicked in Cullen's mind. That particular sensation mechanics know when disparate parts suddenly align into a functional whole. He'd been thinking about the problem wrong. They'd all been thinking about it wrong. The Sherman wasn't a mountain goat. It wasn't built to climb obstacles. It was built to drive through them. But you couldn't drive through a hedgerow any more than you could drive through a concrete wall. The roots were too deep, too dense. The tank would simply bog down, treads spinning uselessly while German gunners took their time aiming. Unless you cut the roots first. Cullen climbed out of the hatch and dropped to the ground. His boots hit mud churned by morning's fighting. He walked toward the bulldozer, mind already racing ahead to calculations of angles, stress points, metal thickness. The dozer operator, a corporal from Iowa whose name Cullen never learned, looked up as he approached. "That blade," Cullen said, pointing. "How's it mounted?" The corporal wiped grease from his hands. "Hydraulic arms. Why?" "Could you take it off?" "Sure, but how long?" The corporal studied him. 20 minutes with the right tools. But that'd leave me with a useless dozer. And give me a useful tank. The idea crystallized as he said it aloud. Mount a blade on the Sherman's nose. Not a full dozer blade. Something smaller, sharper. Steel teeth that could bite into the hedgerow's base, severing roots before the tank attempted to push through. The Sherman would stay level. Stay protected. Drive straight into the next field with its armor angled correctly. Guns ready, instead of climbing exposed and blind. The corporal was shaking his head. "Even if I gave you the blade, how you planning to attach it? Sherman's not designed for that kind of modification. No, Cullen admitted. But the Germans are helping us out there. He'd seen them everywhere. German anti-tank obstacles littering every field and roadside. Steel I-beams driven into the ground at angles, designed to gut tank treads or puncture hulls. Thousands of them scattered across Normandy. The engineers had been cutting them apart with torches, clearing paths, treating them as garbage. Cullen saw them as raw materials. Heavy gauge steel, pre-shaped into straight lengths. Strong enough to stop a 30-ton tank. More than strong enough to serve as mounting brackets for a blade. "You got welding equipment?" he asked. "In the supply truck." "Then I need 4 of those German obstacles, your blade, and 12 hours." The corporal looked at him like he was insane. Maybe he was. Cullen had never welded anything to a tank before. Didn't know if it was even possible. But he knew the math. Weight distribution, structural integrity. If he could mount the blade low enough, angle it slightly downward, let the tank's own forward momentum do the work of cutting. It might work. Or it might rip the entire front assembly off the Sherman the first time they tried it. Only one way to find out. By sunset, word had spread through the 2nd Armored Division that some sergeant from New Jersey was attempting something either brilliant or suicidal with a Dozer blade and German scrap metal. Officers came to watch. Most shook their heads and walked away. A few stayed, curious despite themselves. Cullen worked through the night with his crew and 2 engineers who'd volunteered. They cut the German obstacles into 8-foot lengths using an acetylene torch, positioned them as prongs extending forward from the Sherman's bow, welded cross braces to distribute stress. The blade itself they modified, cutting it down to 5 feet wide, sharpening the bottom edge into 4 thick teeth. Miller, the driver, kept asking questions. How much weight was this adding? Would it affect the transmission? Could the engine handle the extra load when cutting through a hedgerow? Cullen didn't have answers. Just educated guesses based on years of working on cars with his father. Metal stressed until it found equilibrium or failed. No middle ground. The welding took 6 hours. Mounting the assembly to the Sherman's front hull took another 4. They used every bolt, bracket, and chain they could salvage. By dawn, my buddy looked like some medieval siege engine, a 30-ton tank with steel tusks projecting from its nose. Captain Roberts, Cullen's company commander, arrived as they were finishing. He circled the Sherman twice, saying nothing. Then he looked at Cullen. "This is either going to work or it's going to get you killed." "Yes, sir." "You willing to test it?" Cullen glanced at his crew. Miller looked terrified. Thompson, the gunner, was trying to hide a grin. Lopez, the loader, just shrugged. "We're ready," Cullen said. They chose a hedgerow on the division's perimeter, one they'd already cleared of Germans. No sense getting shot while testing an untried modification. Word spread fast. By the time Cullen's Sherman rumbled into position, nearly 50 men had gathered to watch. The hedgerow stood 12 feet high. Hawthorn trees so densely grown their branches formed a solid wall, roots that had been drinking Norman soil for 4 centuries, the kind of obstacle that had stopped American armor cold for the past week. Cullen settled into the commander's hatch. His hands were shaking slightly. He forced them still. "Miller," he said into the intercom. "Slow approach. When I give the word, full throttle straight ahead. Don't stop for anything. Even if the blade rips off. Especially if the blade rips off. We stop in the middle of that hedgerow. We're stuck." The Sherman lurched forward. 20 yards to the hedgerow. 15. 10. The steel prongs extended ahead like a knight's lance. Cullen could see where the blade's teeth would make contact, right at the base where root met earth. "Now," he said. Miller floored the accelerator. The Sherman's 4 GAA engine roared, all 500 horsepower channeling through the transmission into the treads. The tank shot forward and the blade teeth hit the hedgerow at 15 miles per hour. The sound was like the earth screaming, metal shrieking against root and stone. The Sherman shuddered, entire hull vibrating so violently Cullen's teeth rattled. He gripped the hatch edge, waiting for something to tear loose. The blade, the mounting brackets, maybe the entire front plate. But it held. The blade cut into the hedgerow's base, steel teeth severing roots 4 inches thick like they were saplings. The Sherman kept moving, kept pushing, 30 tons of American armor forcing its way through an obstacle that had seemed impregnable just seconds before. Branches scraped across the hull. Dirt cascaded into the driver's vision slit. The engine labored, RPMs climbing, but it never faltered. Then they were through. The Sherman burst into the next field, blade still attached, prongs bent but intact. Cullen twisted in the hatch, looking back. Where the hedgerow had stood unbroken, there was now a gap 10 feet wide, clean enough that another tank could follow. The watching soldier stood silent for 3 seconds. Then someone started cheering. Then everyone was cheering. Captain Roberts walked up to the Sherman as Cullen climbed out. The captain's expression hadn't changed, but something had shifted in his eyes. "How long to build another one?" he asked. "With the right materials? 6 hours. You have until tomorrow morning to build 15. By noon the next day, every tank in the company was lined up for modification. Cullen and his crew worked assembly line style, cutting German obstacles, welding prongs, mounting blades. Other tanks contributed their crews to help. Word reached division headquarters, then corps, then army. A full colonel showed up at 1800 hours, watched Cullen's work for 10 minutes, and commandeered a jeep back to headquarters. 48 hours after Cullen's first test, General Omar Bradley himself stood beside my buddy, examining the welded prongs with a critical eye. "This actually works?" Bradley asked. "Yes, sir. We've cut through 23 hedgerows without a single failure." Bradley turned to his staff officers. "I want these on every Sherman in the theater. How fast can we do it?" An ordnance major checked his clipboard. "Sir, we don't have enough Dozer blades for—" "Then use whatever works. Tank treads, steel plates. I don't care if you weld railroad ties to the front. The Germans gave us a defensive network they thought was impenetrable. This sergeant just made it obsolete." The major looked at Cullen. "Can you write up specifications?" Cullen spent that night documenting everything. Measurements, angles, welding points, stress calculations. By morning, his rough sketches were being reproduced and distributed to every armored unit in Normandy. By the end of the week, field workshops were producing the modifications around the clock. They called them Rhino tanks. Some men claimed it was because the prongs looked like a rhinoceros horn. Others said it was because once you got a Sherman moving with that blade attached, nothing could stop it. Both were probably true. The Germans noticed the change within days. Their defensive doctrine had relied on channeling American armor into predetermined killing zones, using the hedgerows to control movement and create ambush opportunities. Suddenly, American tanks were ignoring the channels, cutting new paths, appearing in fields the Germans had considered inaccessible. Cullen's Sherman was among the first wave to push into the bocage country south of Carentan. They cut through 14 hedgerows in 2 hours, moving faster through Norman farmland than American armor had moved since D-Day. German positions that had held for a week found themselves flanked, surrounded, bypassed entirely. In one field near St. Lo, Cullen's crew encountered a German Panzer IV waiting in ambush behind a hedgerow. Standard defensive position. The German commander had probably been sitting there for hours, waiting for an American tank to climb the hedgerow and expose its belly. Instead, Cullen's Sherman cut straight through the hedgerow at full speed and appeared 30 feet from the Panzer's flank. The German crew was still traversing their turret when Thompson put a 75mm round through their side armor. The fight lasted 4 seconds. Not every engagement went that smoothly. The Rhino modification didn't make Shermans invincible, just mobile. German anti-tank guns still killed tanks. Panzerfausts still brewed up crews, but the fundamental tactical equation had changed. American armor was no longer constrained by 400-year-old farm boundaries. The hedgerows had gone from impenetrable barriers to minor obstacles that slowed movement by seconds rather than hours. Cullen watched the change ripple through the division. Confidence returning to crews who'd spent days watching friends die attempting to climb hedgerows. Commanders planning operations that would have been impossible a week earlier. The bocage was still deadly, still claimed American lives with every mile gained, but it was no longer a fortress. 3 weeks after the first test, Cullen's Sherman sat in an orchard outside a small town whose name he couldn't pronounce. They'd covered 30 miles in 2 days, distance that would have taken 2 weeks before the Rhino modification. The blade was battered, prongs twisted from cutting through dozens of hedgerows, but it still worked. Miller was doing maintenance on the transmission. Thompson was cleaning the main gun. Lopez was heating sea rations over a small fire. Normal crew routines in the brief pause between movements. Captain Roberts appeared through the trees, picking his way around shell craters. "Sergeant Cullen," he said, "you're being pulled back to Corps headquarters." Cullen felt his stomach drop. Being pulled from the front usually meant one of two things: court-martial or death notification for family. "Sir?" They want you to demonstrate the modification for a War Department film crew. Show other units how it's done. Robert smiled slightly. Congratulations. You just changed how this army fights. Cullen looked at his tank, at his crew, at the blade that had carried them through 3 weeks of hell relatively intact. Sir, with respect, I'd rather stay with my unit. Noted. Orders are orders. Roberts extended his hand. That blade of yours saved this division, Sergeant. Probably saved the entire campaign. Don't forget that. They shook hands. Cullen climbed into my buddy one last time, running his hand along the welded prongs. He'd made them from German scrap metal in a single night, working on intuition and half-remembered lessons from his father's garage. And somehow, impossibly, they'd worked. The hedgerows of Normandy would claim thousands more American lives before the breakout succeeded, but they'd never again stop American armor cold. Never again channel entire divisions into predictable killing zones. A staff sergeant with a welder had broken the backbone of German defensive strategy with 8 hours of work and some salvaged steel. Sometimes the difference between victory and defeat came down to one man looking at a problem differently, seeing not an obstacle but raw materials, not a wall but a question waiting for an answer. Cullen left France 2 days later. My buddy stayed behind with a new crew, cutting through hedgerows all the way to the German border. The Rhino modification became standard equipment on thousands of American tanks. The Germans never found an effective counter. How do you defend against an enemy that refuses to follow the terrain you've chosen for them? Years later, military historians would debate the significance of the Rhino tanks. Some argued they were crucial to the breakout from Normandy. Others claimed they were merely useful, that superior numbers and air support would have won regardless. The men who fought in the bocage didn't debate. They remembered sitting in their Shermans, staring at hedgerows they couldn't cross, knowing that attempting to climb meant death. They remembered the first time they cut straight through instead, watching centuries-old roots give way before American steel and one sergeant's midnight inspiration. They remembered that sometimes victory arrived not with overwhelming force but with a clever solution to an impossible problem. That warfare's greatest innovations often came not from generals or engineers, but from ordinary men who refused to accept that obstacles were permanent. Curtis Cullen went home to New Jersey after the war, opened his own garage, fixed cars and trucks and tractors for farmers who never knew they were being served by the man who'd changed modern warfare with a Dozer blade and some German scrap metal. He died in 1963, quietly, in the same town where he'd been born. The Medal of Honor nomination submitted by Captain Roberts had been lost in paperwork somewhere between Normandy and Washington. The War Department film was shown to other units, but Cullen's name was misspelled in the credits. But every Sherman tank that cut through a hedgerow carried his innovation forward. Every crew that survived because they could move freely through the bocage owed their lives to 12 hours of welding and one sergeant's refusal to accept the impossible. The hedgerows still stand in Normandy. Ancient boundaries that have outlasted empires and wars. Here and there, if you know where to look, you can find gaps in them. Places where something heavy and unstoppable once carved a path straight through obstacles that had seemed eternal. The earth remembers. Metal rusts and men die, but the ground keeps the scars of the moments when history pivoted on small innovations and desperate ingenuity. Sometimes a war is won not by the biggest gun, but by the simplest idea, executed with whatever materials are at hand and the conviction that there must be a better way. If you're listening to this story right now, whether you're in the fields where these events unfolded, or halfway around the world, leave a comment below and tell us where you are. These histories connect us across continents and decades. I'd like to know where this particular piece of the past has reached. July 1944. Saint-Lô, France. The city burned for 3 days after the Americans took it. What remained barely qualified as a city at all, just rubble and smoke and the sweet sick smell of bodies buried under collapsed stone. The 29th Infantry Division had paid for every block in blood, and now they sat among the ruins, waiting for orders that would send them forward again. Lieutenant Kenneth Moore stood at the edge of what had once been a town square, watching a column of Shermans rumble past. Every tank bore the now familiar Rhino modification. Steel prongs jutting from their bows like the tusks of prehistoric beasts. Some were pristine, freshly welded in field workshops. Others were battered and twisted from days of cutting through hedgerows, but still functional. Moore was 24, a platoon leader in the 116th Infantry Regiment. He'd been in Normandy since D-Day, had watched the initial invasion nearly falter on Omaha Beach, had spent 6 weeks fighting through bocage country that devoured men and machines with equal indifference. He'd seen the Rhino tanks in action dozens of times now. Watched them transform impossible advances into merely difficult ones. But he'd also seen something the tankers hadn't noticed yet. Something that made his stomach tighten every time a modified Sherman rolled past. The Germans were adapting. It had started 2 weeks ago during the push towards St. Lo. Moore's platoon had been advancing behind a company of Rhino tanks, using them as mobile cover while they cleared German infantry from a series of connected fields. Standard combined arms tactics that had been working well since the modifications became widespread. Then one of the lead Shermans cut through a hedgerow and exploded. Not from a Panzerfaust or anti-tank gun. From a mine. A massive one, buried at the exact point where the tank would breach the hedgerow. The explosion had been powerful enough to flip the Sherman onto its side, killing the entire crew instantly. At first, Moore had assumed it was random chance. The Germans had mined extensively throughout Normandy. Hitting one was unfortunate but inevitable. But then it happened again. And again. Always at the breach point. Always timed perfectly to catch a Sherman as it cut through. The Germans had figured out the pattern. Rhino tanks didn't climb hedgerows, they cut through at ground level. Which meant their path was predictable. Which meant you could mine it in advance if you knew where they'd breach. Moore had reported this to his company commander, who'd passed it up to battalion, who'd supposedly forwarded it to division. But in the chaos of the St. Lo offensive, the information had been lost in the flood of reports about casualties, ammunition shortages, and German counterattacks. Now, watching the Shermans roll past, Moore wondered how many of them would last the week. One of the tank commanders waved at him from an open hatch, a staff sergeant whose name Moore didn't know, but whose face he recognized from shared foxholes and brief conversations during artillery barrages. The sergeant looked confident, almost cocky. Why wouldn't he be? His tank could go anywhere now. The hedgerows had been conquered. Moore didn't wave back. He was thinking about the 5 Shermans he'd watched burn in the past week, all of them destroyed by mines planted at hedgerow breach points. He was thinking about the German defensive doctrine, which had always been about adaptation and counter-innovation. The Wehrmacht had lost the hedgerow advantage, but they weren't stupid. They'd found a new way to kill American tanks. 15 miles southeast, in a farmhouse that had somehow survived the bombardment, Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber studied a hand-drawn map of the local hedgerow network. Weber commanded a heavy weapons platoon in the 353rd Infantry Division, what remained of it anyway. His original complement of 80 men had been reduced to 37 through 6 weeks of continuous combat. But those 37 had learned things that fresh units from Germany couldn't know yet. They'd learned how Americans fought with their modified tanks. They'd learned the patterns. Weber traced his finger along a line of hedgerows on the map. The Americans would come from the north, almost certainly. They'd been pushing south for days, grinding through German positions with their usual combination of artillery, air support, and overwhelming material superiority. The Rhino tanks made them faster now, but also more predictable. "The mines are placed here, here, and here?" Weber asked, pointing to 3 breach points along the expected American axis of advance. Feldwebel Kruger nodded. "Teller mines, 4 per position. Set shallow enough that infantry won't trigger them, but positioned perfectly for the tank treads. And the fallback positions? 200 meters behind each minefield. Heavy machine guns with interlocking fields of fire. When the tanks hit the mines and stop, we kill the infantry. When they send more tanks to clear the mines, we kill those too." It was elegant in its way. Use the Americans' own innovation against them. The Rhino tanks had restored mobility to American armor, but at the cost of predictability. They cut through hedgerows in straight lines now, following the most direct paths, which meant you could prepare those paths, turn them into kill zones. Weber had first noticed the pattern 3 weeks ago, shortly after the modified Shermans began appearing in large numbers. His platoon had been defending a series of fields near Carentan when a Rhino tank cut through a hedgerow 50 meters from his position. The American tank had emerged at exactly the point where the hedgerow was thinnest, where cutting would be easiest. Weber's men had destroyed it with a Panzerfaust, but the lesson had stuck. American tankers chose the path of least resistance. Find the weakest point in the hedgerow, cut through there. Logical, efficient, predictable. Over the following weeks, Weber had refined the counter-tactic. Mine the obvious breach points. Position anti-tank weapons to cover them from concealment. Let the Americans' own optimization work against them. It had worked disturbingly well. His platoon alone had destroyed 8 Shermans in 10 days, all with minimal German casualties. The Americans kept coming, kept using the same tactics, apparently unaware that their innovation had spawned a counter-innovation. "They'll be here by morning," Weber said, rolling up the map. "Make sure the men understand. No one fires until the first tank hits the mines. We need the infantry exposed and committed before we engage." Kruger saluted and disappeared into the ruined farmhouse. Weber stood alone in what had once been a bedroom, looking out through a shell hole at the Norman countryside. Peaceful hedgerows and gentle fields that had become an abattoir. He'd been fighting in France for 40 days. Before that, 2 years on the Eastern Front. He was 26 years old and felt 50. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Americans had solved the hedgerow problem with ingenuity and improvisation. Now the Germans were using the same qualities to turn that solution into a trap. War was like that. A conversation conducted in steel and blood, each side answering the other's innovations with increasingly desperate creativity. He wondered if the Americans would figure out the mine pattern before they ran out of tanks. He wondered if he'd live long enough to see it. The attack came at dawn, precisely as Weber had predicted. American artillery hammered German positions for 30 minutes, shells screaming overhead in a steel thunderstorm that turned the morning sky orange. Then the Shermans came. 5 of them in loose formation, Rhino prongs glinting in the early light. Infantry followed in dispersed groups, using the tanks as cover. Weber watched through binoculars from his concealed position 200 meters back. The lead Sherman approached the first hedgerow, a particularly thick one crowned with ancient oaks. The tank commander surveyed it briefly, then directed his driver toward the obvious weak point, where younger growth suggested easier cutting. Exactly where Weber's men had planted 4 teller mines in a tight cluster. The Sherman's blade bit into the hedgerow. Steel teeth severed roots. The tank pushed forward, treads churning earth. 30 tons of American engineering forcing its way through an obstacle that had stopped earlier offensives cold. Then the right tread found the first mine. The explosion was massive, 4 teller mines detonating in sequence, each containing 11 pounds of TNT. The Sherman's right side lifted 3 feet off the ground, tread snapping like a broken chain. The tank crashed back down at an angle, immobilized, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. The crew bailed out immediately, tumbling from hatches with the practiced desperation of men who knew their tank was about to cook off. They sprinted for cover, but German machine gun fire caught 2 of them in the open. The other 3 made it to a crater. The following Sherman stopped, uncertain. Their commanders had just watched their lead tank hit a mine at the exact breach point, which should have been clear. The infantry went to ground, seeking whatever cover the exposed field offered. Weber waited. Patience was everything. Let them commit. Let them send engineers forward to check for more mines. Let them bunch up behind the disabled Sherman, using it as cover. An American lieutenant emerged from the infantry positions, directing men forward, setting up a base of fire, preparing to suppress German positions while engineers cleared the mines. Standard doctrine, executed professionally. Weber raised his hand, waiting for the perfect moment. Then he dropped it. German machine guns opened up from 3 concealed positions simultaneously. MG-42s, firing at their characteristic 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound like fabric tearing at impossible speed. The Americans in the open went down immediately. Others scrambled for cover that didn't exist in the freshly plowed field. One of the Shermans tried to back up, but its commander apparently realized the danger of exposing his thin rear armor. Instead, the tank traversed its turret, searching for targets. The German machine gun positions were too well concealed. The Sherman fired blind, 75mm rounds exploding harmlessly in empty fields. Then a Panzerfaust team emerged from a spider hole 20 meters from the tank's flank. 2 men, one carrying the launcher, one serving as spotter. They fired at point-blank range, and the shaped charge punched through the Sherman's side armor like tissue paper. The tank brewed up instantly, flames shooting from every hatch. The remaining 3 Shermans retreated, laying smoke. The American infantry withdrew under covering fire, dragging wounded with them. The entire engagement lasted 7 minutes. Weber counted casualties from his position. 2 Shermans destroyed, 1 disabled. Approximately 15 American infantry dead or wounded. German losses, 0. 1 MG-42 barrel overheated and would need replacement. That was all. The Americans would be back, probably within hours. They always came back. Superior numbers and material meant they could absorb losses that would cripple a German unit and still maintain offensive pressure. But for now, Weber's sector was secure. His improvised counter to the Rhino modification had worked exactly as planned. He wondered how long before the Americans figured out the pattern. Days? Weeks? And what would they do then? Back at the American lines, Lieutenant Moore was having the same conversation he'd been having for 2 weeks. "Sir, they're mining the breach points," he told Major Harrison, his battalion commander. "Every time a Rhino tank cuts through a hedgerow, there's a chance of hitting a mine cluster. The Germans have figured out our pattern." Harrison looked exhausted. The St. Lo offensive had ground him down, turned a confident officer into a man who jumped at sudden noises and drank too much coffee. "You're saying the Rhino modification doesn't work anymore?" "No, sir. I'm saying it works exactly the same way every time, which means the Germans can predict where we'll breach and prepare accordingly. So what's the solution? Go back to climbing hedgerows and getting shot in the belly?" Moore had been thinking about this for days. "We need to vary the breach points, make it random, or send engineers ahead to clear mines before the tanks go through. Or, we don't have time for that," Harrison interrupted. "Corps wants us moving south immediately. The breakout depends on maintaining momentum. If we stop to clear mines at every hedgerow, we'll be here until Christmas. Then we'll keep losing tanks. We have tanks to lose." Harrison said it flatly without emotion. A simple statement of material fact. America could build Shermans faster than Germany could destroy them. Therefore, accepting tank losses was strategically rational. Moore understood the logic. Hated it, but understood it. War at this scale wasn't about individual lives or machines. It was about ratios and replacement rates. The Americans could absorb losses that would be catastrophic for the Germans, could trade material for time and territory and still come out ahead. But that didn't make it easier to watch Shermans burn, because they'd fallen into predictable patterns. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Harrison waved his hand. "Go ahead." The Rhino modification solved one problem and created another. We got mobility back but lost unpredictability. The Germans are adapting faster than we are. If we don't adapt in turn, we'll end up right back where we started. Except now we're overconfident because we think the hedgerow problem is solved. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and took a deep drag. "You're right," he said finally. "But you're also thinking tactically. Strategically, we're still winning. The hedgerows slowed us down for weeks. Now we're moving again. Even with the mine problem, the Germans can plant mines faster than we can clear them, but they can't replace tanks faster than we can build them. They can't replace veteran crews faster than we can train them. They're fighting a delaying action with increasingly desperate tactics. We just have to outlast them. And how many crews die while we're outlasting them? However many it takes." Harrison stubbed out his cigarette. "That's war, Lieutenant. The Rhino tanks gave us an advantage. The Germans found a counter. We'll find a counter to their counter. But we do it while moving forward, not sitting still." Dismissed. Moore saluted and left, feeling hollow. Harrison wasn't wrong. The mathematics of attrition warfare supported every word he'd said. But mathematics didn't burn alive inside a disabled Sherman. Numbers didn't scream when teller mines ripped through their legs. He walked back to his platoon's position, passing a field workshop where mechanics were attaching Rhino modifications to fresh Shermans just arrived from the replacement depot. The new tanks gleamed, unmarked by combat. Their crews looked impossibly young. Moore wanted to warn them. Tell them about the mines, the patterns, the way the Germans had turned American innovation into a trap. But what good would it do? They'd find out soon enough. And they'd either survive the learning, or they wouldn't. That night, in a tent behind the lines, 3 tank commanders from different companies met informally to discuss what they were all noticing, but no one was officially acknowledging. Staff Sergeant William Dawson, Sergeant First Class James Martinez, and Sergeant Robert Chen, veterans who'd survived weeks of bocage fighting and knew something had changed. "They're predicting our breach points," Dawson said without preamble. "I've hit 3 minefields in the past week, all of them at the exact spot where I was planning to cut through." Martinez nodded. "Same. And it's not random mine placement. These are deliberate, concentrated, designed to catch rhinos specifically." "So we're back to square one," Chen said. "Except now we think we have the solution, which makes us careless." They sat in silence for a moment. 3 men who'd seen the war from inside 30 tons of armor, who understood that their survival depended on adapting faster than the enemy. "We need to be less predictable," Dawson said finally. "Stop choosing the obvious breach points. Cut through where it's harder, where the Germans wouldn't expect mines." "That slows us down," Martinez pointed out. "Takes longer to cut through thick growth. Rather slow than dead. And we need to vary our approach," Chen added, Sometimes cut through, sometimes go around, sometimes wait and let artillery blow a gap. Keep the Germans guessing. Have you tried suggesting this to the brass? Martinez asked. Dawson laughed bitterly. My company commander told me I was being paranoid. Said the mine problem was no worse than before the Rhino modification. Mine said we don't have time to be cautious, Chen said. Push forward, maintain momentum, accept losses as necessary. They were quiet again, recognizing the fundamental problem. The Rhino tanks had become doctrine. The modification had spread through the entire army, from Normandy to the planning rooms in England. Everyone believed the hedgerow problem was solved. Suggesting otherwise, admitting that the Germans had found an effective counter, would mean acknowledging that the innovation everyone celebrated had limitations. Armies didn't like admitting limitations of new doctrine, especially doctrine that was working by the metrics that mattered to generals. Territory gained, German positions overrun, momentum maintained. The fact that individual tanks were dying in predictable patterns was considered acceptable losses. So we adapt on our own, Dawson said. Spread the word to other crews. Vary breach points. Scout ahead when possible. Assume every obvious gap is mined. And hope enough of us survive to make it matter, Martinez added. They talked through the night, sharing observations and developing informal tactics that might help them survive. No official orders, no command approval, just soldiers trying to stay alive by thinking one step ahead of the enemy. By morning, word was spreading through informal networks. Tank commanders talking to other tank commanders. Crews sharing lessons learned. A grassroots adaptation happening beneath the notice of higher command. Driven by the simple desire to not die in a fireball because they'd chosen the predictable breach point. The Germans noticed the change within days. American tanks suddenly avoiding obvious gaps, choosing harder breaches, occasionally bypassing hedgerows entirely. The mine trap still caught some Shermans, but not as many. The Americans were learning, adapting, evolving their tactics in response to the German counter-innovation. Weber watched an American tank approach a hedgerow his men had mined. The Sherman slowed, stopped, then backed up and circled to breach at a different point, one where the growth was thicker but unmined. It took the tank 5 minutes longer to cut through, but it survived. He smiled grimly. The conversation continued. Innovation, counter-innovation, counter-counter-innovation. Both sides learning, adapting, trying to kill each other more efficiently. By late July, the mine tactic was losing effectiveness. The Americans had adjusted, not through official doctrine or command directives, but through the collective learning of men who wanted to survive. They varied their approaches, scouted suspicious ground, sometimes abandoned the Rhino modification entirely in favor of finding gaps in the hedgerow network. The hedgerows remained deadly. The bocage still chewed up American and German units with equal brutality. But the particular pattern, Rhino tank cuts through predictable breach point, hits mine cluster, dies, was becoming less common. Weber's platoon retreated south toward the Weir River, part of the general German withdrawal under American pressure. His counter-tactic had worked for a few weeks, killed perhaps 30 American tanks before becoming obsolete. Now he'd need to find a new way to even the odds against an enemy with inexhaustible material superiority. The war went on. The innovations continued. Small advantages that lasted days or weeks before being countered. The Rhino tanks kept cutting through hedgerows, but with more caution now, more variation, more respect for an enemy that never stopped adapting. And in the fields of Normandy, the scars multiplied, gaps cut through ancient boundaries, craters from mines and shells, burned out hulks of tanks from both sides. The earth remembered every innovation and counter-innovation, every clever solution and desperate improvisation. The ground kept score in metal and bone. Sometimes victory came not from a single innovation, but from the ability to keep innovating, to recognize when the enemy had found your pattern and break it before the pattern killed you. The Rhino tanks had changed the war. The German mines had changed it back. And the crews who survived were the ones who understood that no advantage lasted forever, that warfare was a conversation where silence meant death. August 1944. Mortagne, France. The fog came in thick that morning, rolling across the Norman hills like a living thing. Visibility dropped to 30 feet, then 20. Then nothing but gray soup and the sound of your own breathing. Lieutenant Moore stood in a shallow trench, watching white tendrils curl through broken trees, and felt his stomach tighten with the instinct that had kept him alive through 2 months of combat. Fog this dense meant the Luftwaffe couldn't fly, which meant American air superiority, the one overwhelming advantage that had been bleeding the Germans white since D-Day, was temporarily gone, and the Germans knew it. The attack came at 0200 hours. Not probing, not reconnaissance. A full-scale counteroffensive involving elements of 4 panzer divisions, nearly 100,000 men, pushing west toward Avranches in a desperate attempt to cut off the American breakout from Normandy. Hitler's personal orders: restore the front or die trying. Moore's company occupied positions on a ridgeline overlooking the town of Mortain. They'd taken the position 3 days earlier, part of the general American advance that had finally broken out of the bocage and into more open country. Everyone had assumed the Germans were finished, retreating east toward the Seine, trying to preserve what remained of their army. Everyone had been wrong. The first indication was sound. Engines. Dozens of them. The distinctive rumble of German tanks moving in column, treads clanking against stone roads. Then shapes in the fog, massive shapes, too large to be anything but heavy armor. Tiger tanks, someone whispered. The words passed down the line like a curse. The Panzer VI Tiger. 56 tons of German engineering, armed with an 88mm gun that could kill a Sherman from 2 miles away. Front armor so thick that American 75mm rounds bounced off like pebbles. The Wehrmacht's answer to Allied material superiority. Build tanks so good that they could trade at 5-to-1 ratios and still come out ahead. Moore had seen Tigers before, always at distance, always retreating. He'd never seen them attacking en masse. Never seen them used the way German doctrine intended, as breakthrough weapons, concentrated and committed to a decisive thrust. Through the fog, he counted 7 Tigers in the lead wave. Behind them, Panzer IVs. Behind those, half-tracks carrying Panzer Grenadiers, a combined arms assault executed with precision despite the visibility. The Americans opened fire, bazookas, machine guns, the few anti-tank guns they'd managed to drag up to the ridgeline. The Tigers ignored the small arms fire. The 80mm guns spoke, and American positions disappeared in eruptions of earth and shrapnel. Moore grabbed the radio handset. "Battalion, this is Baker Company. We have multiple Tigers moving on our position. Request immediate armor support. Over. Static. Then." "Baker Company, all armor is engaged at other sectors. You'll have to hold with what you have. Air support is grounded due to weather. Over." Which meant they were on their own against a German armored thrust, with nothing but infantry weapons and a few anti-tank guns that couldn't penetrate Tiger armor frontally. Moore looked at his men. Young faces, most of them. Replacements who'd arrived after St. Lo. They were watching him, waiting for orders that would keep them alive. "Fall back to secondary positions," he said. "Leapfrog withdrawal. We can't stop them, but we can slow them down." The company retreated in stages, one platoon covering while another displaced, using every crater and stone wall as temporary shelter. The Tigers came on methodically, grinding forward at walking pace, firing at anything that moved. German infantry followed in their shadow, mopping up American positions the tanks had bypassed. By 0400 hours, Moore's company had been pushed back 2 miles. They'd lost 30% of their strength. The Tigers had lost nothing, a few scratches on their armor, a damaged tread on one tank. That was all. But the German advance had slowed, not stopped, but slowed. And every hour of delay was an hour closer to the fog lifting and American air power returning. 5 miles north, Sergeant Dawson sat in his Sherman, listening to the radio chatter and understanding that the entire American position was collapsing. The German counteroffensive had punched through thinly held lines at multiple points. Tigers and Panthers were rampaging through rear areas, destroying supply dumps, overrunning headquarters elements. The Americans had been caught completely by surprise, still organized for offense rather than defense. Dawson's tank company had been rushed forward as emergency reinforcements, part of a desperate effort to plug the gaps. They'd arrived at a crossroads south of Mortain just before dawn, expecting to find friendly infantry. Instead, they'd found burning trucks and dead GIs. And now they could hear German armor approaching through the fog. "Contact front," the gunner called. "Range, I can't tell. Maybe 200 yards. "Load AP," Dawson ordered. Armor piercing. The only round that had any chance against heavy German tanks, and even then, only if you hit the right spot at the right angle from the right distance. The Sherman's modified Rhino prongs extended ahead into the fog like blind fingers. Dawson had kept the modification despite its predictability problems. You never knew when you'd need to cut through an obstacle, and right now they were in relatively open country. Farmland and small villages, not the dense bocage. The prongs were dead weight here, but removing them required time they didn't have. The shape emerged from gray mist. Low hull, angled armor, long gun. Panther, Dawson said. The Panzer V 45 tons, 75 mm high-velocity gun. Front armor nearly as thick as a Tiger's. The Wehrmacht's newest answer to the Sherman and by most measures, a better tank in every way. Waiting for a shot, the gunner said. His voice was steady, professional. Thomas had been with Dawson since the bocage. He knew his business. The Panther hadn't seen them yet. It was moving across their front at an angle, turret traverse to cover a different direction. Thomas was waiting for the perfect moment, when the Panther's side armor was exposed, when range was optimal, when their first shot had the best chance of penetrating. Now, Dawson said. The Sherman's 75mm gun fired. The round crossed 200 yards in a fraction of a second and slammed into the Panther's side armor just below the turret ring. Sparks. The distinctive clang of steel on steel. But no penetration. The round had hit at a bad angle, glanced off. The Panther's turret whipped around with terrifying speed, German optics and training doing their work. They'd identified the threat, acquired the target, and were preparing to fire back, all in the 5 seconds it took Dawson to realize their first shot had failed. Reverse, he shouted. Back up now. The Sherman lurched backward as Thomas frantically reloaded. The Panther fired. The 75mm round passed through the space where Dawson's tank had been sitting 2 seconds earlier and exploded against a stone wall behind them. Smoke, Dawson ordered. Lay smoke and displace. The Sherman's smoke mortars fired, pumping white phosphorus into the air. Within seconds, the fog was supplemented by artificial smoke, visibility dropping to 0. Dawson's driver backed the tank into a side street, putting a building between them and the Panther's gun. We can't fight them head-on, Thomas said, stating the obvious. No, Dawson agreed. But we can make them pay for every yard. Over the next 4 hours, Dawson's company fought a running battle through Mortaine's outskirts. Ambush, shoot, displace. Never staying in one position long enough for German tanks to pin them down. Using the terrain, using smoke, using every trick they'd learned in 2 months of combat. They killed 2 Panthers and a Panzer IV, losing 3 Shermans in the exchange. By conventional metrics, that was a favorable kill ratio. By the reality of material availability, it meant the Germans were winning. America could replace 3 Shermans faster than Germany could replace 2 Panthers. But that didn't help the crews who burned. Sergeant Martinez's tank was among the American losses. Dawson watched it happen from 200 yards away, a Panther round punching through the Sherman's front armor, the tank brewing up instantly. No one got out. Martinez and his crew gone in the time it took to blink. Dawson had known Martinez since training. They'd shared a tent during the Atlantic crossing, had fought together through the hedgerows, had stayed up late 3 nights ago discussing tactics for dealing with mined breach points. Now Martinez was just smoke and burning metal. The war went on. By noon, the fog was finally starting to lift. Patches of blue sky appeared overhead. And with them came the sound every German soldier had learned to fear. Aircraft engines. American fighters and fighter bombers that had been grounded all morning, now launching from their forward airfields in a massive strike against the German armored columns. Dawson watched through his periscope as a squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts appeared over the ridgeline, carrying rockets and bombs. The Luftwaffe was nowhere in sight. Whatever protection the fog had given the Germans was gone now. The P-47s dove, rockets streaking toward the German tanks like falling stars. High-explosive warheads designed to crack open armor from above, where it was thinnest. The Tigers and Panthers that had seemed invincible an hour ago were suddenly vulnerable, burning under aerial assault they couldn't counter. The German advance stalled, then stopped, then reversed as surviving tanks pulled back toward defensive positions, trying to escape the killing ground. American armor pushed forward again, Shermans that had been retreating all morning now advancing through streets littered with burning vehicles. The counteroffensive hadn't failed completely. The Germans had gained ground, disrupted American plans, bought time. But the decisive breakthrough Hitler had demanded never materialized, because the fog had lifted, because American air power had returned, because the Wehrmacht's desperate gamble had depended on a narrow window of opportunity, and that window had closed. Dawson's Sherman rolled past a destroyed Tiger. The massive tank sat motionless, turret blown off by a bomb hit, smoke still rising from the hull. Its crew lay scattered around it, killed trying to bail out. Dawson looked at their faces as he passed. Young, German, dead. Just like Martinez. Just like the thousands of other young men on both sides who died in Normandy, killed by machinery they'd never wanted to understand. That evening, Lieutenant Moore stood in what remained of his company's position on the Mortagne ridgeline. 47 men left out of the 120 who'd occupied these trenches at dawn. The line had held, barely, reinforced by armor and air power that arrived just in time. Major Harrison appeared, picking his way through shell craters. He looked even more exhausted than usual, eyes red-rimmed, uniform caked with mud and dried blood that probably wasn't his. "Hell of a day," he said. "Yes, sir. The Germans gave us everything they had. Tigers, Panthers, their best infantry divisions, all concentrated on a narrow front, trying for the killing blow." "Why here?" Moore asked. "Why Mortagne?" Harrison pulled out a map, unfolding it on the hood of a damaged jeep. "Geography. If they'd broken through here, they could have driven west to Avranches, cut our supply lines, trapped 3 corps south of the breakthrough. It would have been a catastrophe. But they didn't break through. No, they got close, damn close. But the line held." Harrison looked at Moore. "Your company bought us time. Every hour you delayed them was an hour closer to the fog lifting. You saved the flank." Moore thought about the men he'd lost, the positions overrun, the desperate retreat that had felt like defeat even though Harrison was calling it victory. "Doesn't feel like saving anything, sir." "It never does. But the Germans just spent their last mobile reserves trying to stop our breakout. They failed. Now there's nothing between us and the Seine except retreating infantry and a few scattered tank units." Harrison refolded the map. "The bocage is behind us. The hedgerows are behind us. The war's about to become mobile. Fast advances, pursuit actions, the kind of fighting our armor was designed for. And the Rhino modifications?" Harrison smiled slightly. "Less useful in open country. But your tank crews won't need them anymore. The terrain's changing. The whole nature of the campaign is changing." He was right, Moore realized. The Battle of Normandy was ending. Not officially. That would take weeks more fighting. But strategically, the Germans had just played their last card and lost. The counter-offensive at Mortagne had been their final attempt to restore the situation, and American infantry with bazookas and anti-tank guns, reinforced by armor and air power, had stopped it cold. Now the pursuit would begin. The race to the Seine, the drive into Germany itself. Fighting that would look nothing like the hedge-by-hedge slog of the past 2 months. "Get some rest," Harrison said. "We move out at dawn. Next stop is Paris." He left. Moore stood alone on the ridgeline, looking out over country that had cost so many lives to take. In the distance, he could still see smoke rising from burning vehicles, American and German both. Wreckage scattered across farmland that had been peaceful 3 months ago. The Rhino modification had changed the war in Normandy, turned impassable hedgerows into minor obstacles, given American armor the mobility it needed to break out of the bocage. The Germans had countered with mines and ambush tactics. The Americans had countered with variation and adaptation. And now, as the campaign entered its final phase, the whole innovation was becoming obsolete. Not because it had failed, but because the terrain no longer required it. The hedgerows were behind them. The steel prongs that had seemed so revolutionary 6 weeks ago were now just extra weight bolted to the front of tanks that needed speed and maneuverability for pursuit actions. War was like that, Moore thought. Solutions that saved lives 1 month became irrelevant the next. Innovations that seemed permanent were temporary by nature. The only constant was adaptation. The endless cycle of problem, solution, counter-solution, new problem. Curtis Cullen's midnight inspiration with a Dozer blade had saved the Normandy campaign. But it hadn't ended the war. Nothing ever ended the war except winning it, and that was still months away. The tank crews began removing Rhino modifications that night, using cutting torches to separate the welded prongs from Sherman bows, restoring the tanks to their original configuration. The steel tusks that had cut through hedgerows for 6 weeks were cast aside, piled at the edges of fields, left behind as the armies moved east. Sergeant Dawson supervised the work on his tank, watching decades of improvised engineering dissolved in showers of sparks. The modification had saved his life a dozen times over, had let him drive through obstacles that would have been death traps otherwise. He felt oddly sentimental about seeing it removed. "Shame to lose it," his driver said, echoing Dawson's thoughts. "We don't need it anymore. We're not fighting in bocage country now." Still, it was nice having options, Dawson nodded. Options had been the real innovation, he realized. Not the specific design of the Rhino prongs, but the mindset they represented. The idea that obstacles could be overcome through clever modification rather than brute force. That tanks didn't have to accept the terrain as given. That soldiers with welding torches could change the fundamental nature of warfare. The prongs came off. The Sherman looked naked without them, lighter but somehow more vulnerable. Dawson ran his hand along the front hull, feeling where the welds had been. The metal was scarred, pitted, marked by the modifications that had once seemed permanent. "All right," he said. "Let's see what's next." What was next turned out to be the fastest advance of the war. American armor breaking out of Normandy and racing east, covering in days distances that had taken weeks to traverse in the bocage. The Germans retreated in disorder, trying to establish new defensive lines and failing, their mobile forces destroyed or trapped in pockets. The Shermans didn't need Rhino modifications anymore. They needed speed, fuel, ammunition. The terrain favored mobility now, favored the American advantages of numbers and logistics over German advantages of individual tank quality. But in the hedgerows of Normandy, the metal remained. Pieces of Cullen's original innovation, scattered across fields and roadsides. Steel prongs that had changed the course of a campaign, now rusting quietly while the war moved on without them. French farmers would find them for decades afterward, buried in their fields, remnants of a time when armies fought hedge by hedge for a few yards of ground. They became scrap metal, fence posts, parts of barn doors. The farmers rarely knew what they'd been, rarely understood the significance of these twisted steel teeth, but the ground remembered. The earth held the memory of innovations born from desperation, of soldiers who refused to accept that obstacles were permanent. The bocage kept its scars, gaps cut through hedgerows, craters where mines had destroyed tanks, the subtle evidence of a campaign where victory came not from overwhelming force, but from adapting faster than the enemy. And somewhere in New Jersey, Curtis Cullen returned to his garage after the war, hung up his uniform and went back to fixing cars. He never spoke much about the modification that bore his name, never claimed credit beyond what the army had given him. He'd seen a problem, found a solution, watched it spread across an army and change a campaign. Then he'd moved on. Because that's what mechanics do. Fix what's broken, adapt what doesn't work. Accept that solutions are temporary and problems are eternal. The war would end in 9 months. But the lesson of the Rhino tanks would outlast it. That warfare belonged not just to the planners and generals, but to the sergeants with welding torches. That innovation came from the bottom up as often as the top down. That sometimes the difference between victory and defeat was a simple idea, executed with whatever materials were at hand. The hedgerows still stand in Normandy. The gaps still mark them. And if you know where to look, if you dig deep enough in certain fields, you can still find pieces of the steel prongs that once turned American tanks into unstoppable breaching tools. The metal rusts. But the innovation remains. Proof that soldiers think as well as fight, that desperation breeds creativity, that obstacles exist only until someone figures out how to overcome them. September 1944. Near the German border. The war had changed its face. Gone were the claustrophobic hedgerows where visibility ended at 30 yards, and every field was a fortress. Now the armies fought across open country, rolling hills and broad valleys where tanks could maneuver, where air power dominated, where speed mattered more than armor thickness. Staff Sergeant William Dawson sat on the turret of his Sherman, watching the sun set over French countryside that would be German countryside by tomorrow. His tank had traveled 300 miles in 3 weeks, a pace that would have been unimaginable back in the bocage. They'd bypassed German strongpoints, raced ahead of supply lines, lived on captured fuel and ammunition. The pursuit was nearly over. The German border loomed ahead, and with it the Siegfried Line, fortifications that made the Atlantic Wall look like a practice exercise. Hitler had given orders. No more retreats. Every inch of German soil would be defended to the death. Which meant the war was about to slow down again. Different terrain, different tactics, different problems requiring different solutions. Dawson thought about the Rhino modifications they'd removed back in Normandy. At the time, it had seemed like discarding a life-saving innovation. Now he understood it was just evolution. The modification had been perfect for bocage fighting, useless for pursuit operations. If they'd kept the prongs, the extra weight would have slowed them down, reduced their range, turned an advantage into a liability. War demanded that kind of flexibility. Solutions that saved you 1 month killed you the next if you couldn't adapt. Thinking about Martinez, his gunner asked, climbing up beside him. Thomas had been asking that question a lot lately. Dawson suspected he was really asking about himself, wondering if he'd be next, if his luck would run out the way Martinez's had at Mortain. Among others, Dawson said. The crew they'd started with in England, 5 men, was down to 3, Martinez dead at Mortain. Collins, the loader, transferred to another tank after taking shrapnel during the breakout, replaced by a kid from Ohio who'd been in France for 2 weeks and still looked terrified every time the engine started. You think about Cullen? Thomas asked. The guy who invented the Rhino? Sometimes. I heard he went home. Back to the States. Army pulled him out to demonstrate the modification. Makes sense. Can't have your innovation genius getting killed by the thing he invented. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, you think anyone will remember? After the war, I mean. Anyone going to care about a welded blade on a tank? Dawson considered the question. The Rhino modification had been famous for about 6 weeks. Every news report, every letter home, every Stars and Stripes article had mentioned the ingenious American sergeant who'd solved the hedgerow problem. Then the breakout happened, the pursuit began, and suddenly everyone was talking about other things. Patton's race across France, the liberation of Paris, the coming invasion of Germany. The Rhino tanks faded into history while the war moved on. The guys who fought in the bocage will remember, Dawson said. The ones who survived because they could cut through hedgerows instead of climbing them, they'll remember. And that's enough? It'll have to be. Across the Atlantic, in a garage in New Jersey, Curtis Cullen was indeed trying to forget. He'd been home for 3 weeks, honorably discharged after the Army determined he was more valuable as a demonstration tool than a combat soldier. They'd paraded him around to various training facilities, had him explain the modification to groups of officers and engineers, filmed him for training videos that would be shown to new tank crews. Then they'd thanked him for his service and sent him home. Now he stood in his father's garage, hands covered in grease, replacing a transmission on a '38 Ford. The work was familiar, comforting, the kind of problem that had clear solutions and no one shot at you while you figured them out. But his mind kept drifting back to France, to the hedgerows, to my buddy and the crew he'd left behind when the Army pulled him out. He'd heard through unofficial channels that his old tank was still fighting, still carrying the modification he'd invented. Different crew now, different commander, but the same steel prongs cutting through the same kind of obstacles, except they weren't cutting through hedgerows anymore. The bocage was behind the front lines now, empty of soldiers, silent except for the wind through broken trees. His innovation had become obsolete the moment it succeeded. Cullen understood the irony. You solved a problem so completely that the problem stopped being relevant. The hedgerows had seemed like an insurmountable obstacle until they weren't. Then the war moved on and found new obstacles. German fortifications, river crossings, winter weather. Things a welded blade couldn't fix. Curtis, his father appeared in the garage doorway. There's someone here to see you. A reporter. Young guy with a notebook and too many questions. He wanted to write a feature story about the hometown hero who changed the war with American ingenuity. Wanted quotes about innovation and determination and the indomitable American spirit. Cullen gave him 15 minutes and sent him away with nothing useful. How do you explain that you'd just been trying to solve a specific problem with the tools at hand? That there was nothing heroic about welding some steel to a tank because the alternative was watching more men burn? That innovation wasn't about genius. It was about refusing to accept that the current method was the only method. The reporter left disappointed. Cullen went back to the Ford's transmission. At least cars didn't need philosophical justification. They either ran or they didn't. Back in France, Lieutenant Kenneth Moore had been promoted to captain and given command of a rifle company in the 29th Infantry Division. They were positioned along the German border, preparing for the next phase of operations, the assault on the Siegfried Line. Moore stood in a command post that had been a German bunker 2 days ago, studying maps and trying to figure out how to keep his men alive through whatever came next. The bocage fighting felt like ancient history now, though it had been less than 2 months. Different war. Different problems. But the lessons remained. He'd learned in the hedgerows that innovation meant nothing if you couldn't adapt. The Rhino modification had been brilliant, until the Germans figured out the pattern and started mining breach points. Then it became a trap for crews who trusted the innovation too much, who stopped thinking tactically because they believed the problem was solved. The ones who survived were the ones who kept adapting, who recognized that every solution was temporary, that the enemy was always learning, always countering, always finding new ways to kill you. Moore tried to instill that mindset in his officers now. Don't fall in love with your tactics. Don't assume yesterday's solution works today. The moment you stop adapting is the moment you start dying. Sir? His executive officer appeared with a sheaf of papers. New orders from regiment. We're moving up to the line tomorrow. Assault on the Siegfried line scheduled for next week. Moore took the papers, scanned them, felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. New terrain. New fortifications. New problems that would require new solutions. The Rhino modifications wouldn't help there. You couldn't cut through concrete bunkers with a welded blade. But the mindset that created the Rhino modification, the refusal to accept obstacles as permanent, that would help. That would keep his men alive while others died doing things the same way they'd always been done. All right, Moore said. Get the company commanders together. We need to talk through approach routes and... An explosion cut him off. Artillery. German 88s, from the sound of it. Ranging fire, testing American positions, looking for targets. Moore grabbed his helmet and headed for the entrance. The war didn't care about his reflections on innovation and adaptation. It just kept grinding forward, kept demanding solutions to new problems, kept killing men who couldn't think fast enough. In a field hospital 50 miles behind the lines, a doctor named Elizabeth Chen worked on a wounded tanker who'd lost his left arm when his Sherman took a Panzerfaust round. The kid was 19 from Iowa, and he kept asking if he'd ever drive a tractor again with one arm. Chen told him yes, because it was true, and because he needed hope more than clinical honesty. Modern prosthetics were getting better. Farm equipment was being designed with accessibility in mind. The kid would go home, would heal, would find a way to adapt, just like the armies adapted, just like the tanks adapted. She'd been in France since D-Day +3, had seen the evolution of wounds as tactics changed. In the bocage, it was mostly shrapnel and burns. Men caught in enclosed spaces when tanks brewed up. During the pursuit, more gunshot wounds and vehicle accidents as units raced ahead of medical support. Now, approaching the Siegfried line, she was seeing the kinds of injuries that came from attacking fortified positions. Artillery fragments, machine gun wounds, blast trauma. The war kept finding new ways to break men. And Chen kept finding new ways to put them back together. Innovation wasn't just about weapons and tactics. It was about medicine, logistics, training, every aspect of warfare that could be improved, adapted, optimized. The tanker from Iowa would survive. Would go home missing an arm, but alive. Would tell people about the time his Sherman got hit, and his crew bailed out, and the medics saved his life. Probably wouldn't mention the Rhino modification his tank had carried, because by the time he was wounded, the modification had been removed and forgotten by everyone except the people who'd needed it. That was how innovation worked in war, Chen thought. Brilliant solutions that lasted weeks or months before being replaced by the next brilliant solution. Nothing permanent except the need to keep adapting or die. She moved to the next patient, carrying that lesson with her. October 1944. The Siegfried line. Sergeant Dawson's Sherman sat in a hull-down position behind a slight rise, watching German fortifications through binoculars. Concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire. Dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles made from reinforced concrete pyramids. Minefields that extended for hundreds of yards. The bocage hedgerows looked simple by comparison. How do we even approach that? Thomas asked from the gunner's position. Carefully, Dawson said. Very carefully. They'd been briefed on the assault plan. Artillery would pound the fortifications for hours. Engineers would blow gaps in the obstacles. Infantry would storm the bunkers while tanks provided covering fire. Classic combined arms assault, executed with American material superiority. It would work, eventually. The Germans couldn't stop the American advance any more than they'd stopped it in Normandy. But it would be costly. Men would die attacking positions that couldn't be flanked or bypassed. The kind of grinding frontal assault that made the bocage fighting look merciful. You ever wonder if we'll survive this? Thomas asked quietly. Dawson lowered the binoculars. It was the question every soldier asked eventually. Usually in the quiet moments before an assault when there was nothing to do but think. We've survived everything else, he said. The hedgerows, Mortain, the pursuit. No reason to think our luck's running out now. Martinez's luck ran out. Martinez's luck ran out at Mortain. Ours didn't. That's all we can control. Not dying today. Tomorrow takes care of itself. It was soldiers' philosophy, fatalistic and pragmatic in equal measure. You couldn't think too far ahead in combat. Couldn't plan for a future that might not exist. You survived the current problem, then dealt with the next one. The Rhino modification had been like that, a solution to an immediate problem. Nobody had been thinking about long-term implications when Cullen welded those prongs on. They'd been thinking about not dying in the next hedgerow assault. And it had worked. Until it didn't. Until the Germans adapted. Until the terrain changed and the modification became irrelevant. Now they faced new problems requiring new solutions. The Siegfried Line wouldn't fall to clever welding or improvised modifications. It would fall to artillery and air power, and infantry willing to die taking bunkers one by one. Different problem, different solution, same war. The assault began at dawn. American artillery hammered German positions in a barrage that lasted 3 hours and consumed more ammunition than some entire World War I offensives. The ground shook. The sky turned orange. And when the guns finally fell silent, the infantry went forward. Dawson's Sherman provided covering fire, pumping 75mm rounds into bunker apertures, while infantry teams worked their way forward with satchel charges and flamethrowers. It was brutal, intimate work, the kind of fighting where you saw the enemy's face before killing him. They took the first line of bunkers by noon. Cost: 43 American dead, 62 wounded. Gain: 300 yards of German territory and a hole in the Siegfried Line. By evening, German counterattacks had pushed the Americans back to their starting positions. The bunkers were retaken. The 43 men had died for nothing. The next day, they tried again. This was the war now. Not mobile operations or clever innovations. Just grinding attrition, trading lives for yards, accepting that progress came at a cost and paying it because the alternative was giving up. Dawson's Sherman fired until its ammunition was exhausted, withdrew to rearm, came back and fired again. Thomas worked the gun with mechanical precision, no longer bothering to confirm each target. Anything that looked like a German position got around. Anything that moved got around. War reduced to its simplest form. Destroy the enemy before he destroys you. The second assault gained 500 yards. Cost: 60 American dead. Gain: 3 more bunkers, a handful of prisoners, and the certain knowledge that the next line of fortifications would be just as tough. That night, sitting on his tank in the dark, Dawson thought about the hedgerows, about how impossible they'd seemed until someone figured out a clever solution, about how the Rhino modification had made them irrelevant. He wished the Siegfried Line could be solved so simply. Wished some sergeant with a welder could innovate away the concrete bunkers and interlocking fire zones and minefields. But some problems didn't have clever solutions. Some obstacles couldn't be overcome with innovation, only with blood and determination and the willingness to keep attacking until the enemy ran out of men or ammunition or will. The Americans had more of all three, which meant they'd win, eventually. But eventually meant weeks or months of this, assaulting fortifications, trading casualties, gaining yards at the cost of lives. "You thinking about the hedgerows?" Thomas asked, climbing up beside him. "Yeah. Miss them." Dawson laughed bitterly. "Never thought I'd say this, but yes. At least there we had options. Could maneuver, could adapt. Here we're just hammering our heads against concrete until something breaks. Us or them?" "Hopefully them." They sat in silence, 2 soldiers waiting for tomorrow's assault, knowing it would look exactly like today's assault, knowing they had no choice but to keep going forward. The Rhino modification felt very far away now. A solution to a different war. A war where cleverness mattered and mobility was possible. This was a different kind of war, the kind that crushed innovation under the weight of fortifications and superior defensive positioning. But they'd break through eventually. American material superiority would tell. The Germans couldn't replace their losses, couldn't resupply their bunkers faster than American artillery destroyed them, couldn't stop the grinding advance any more than they'd stopped it in Normandy. Different terrain, different tactics. Same outcome. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The German offensive came out of fog and snow, just like Mortain had come out of fog and dawn. Except this was bigger. Much bigger. 3 entire panzer armies striking through terrain the Americans had considered impassable, aiming to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp. Lieutenant Moore, Major Moore now, promoted twice in 4 months, found himself in command of a battalion thrown into the path of the German advance. They occupied positions around a town called Bastogne, surrounded by German forces, cut off from supply, fighting a desperate defensive battle in winter weather that grounded air support. It was Mortain again, except worse. Except this time the Germans had committed everything. Their last reserves, their newest tanks, their best remaining units. One final throw of the dice to turn the war around before the inevitable end. Moore stood in a cellar that served as battalion headquarters, looking at maps that showed German units converging from 3 directions. His battalion was outnumbered 5-1. Artillery ammunition was running low. Food was running out. Medical supplies nearly exhausted. "Sir," his operations officer said, "Division is asking if we can hold." Moore looked at the map, at the German forces surrounding Bastogne, at the thin line of American units trying to contain a breakthrough that threatened to unravel the entire Western Front. "Tell them we'll hold," he said. "Because what else could you say? That you were giving up? That the obstacle was too big, the enemy too strong, the situation too desperate?" The hedgerows had seemed impossible until someone figured out how to cut through them. The Siegfried Line had seemed impenetrable until American persistence ground it down. This was just another obstacle, bigger, more dangerous, but still just another problem requiring a solution. The solution turned out to be the same one that had worked in Normandy. American soldiers refusing to quit, adapting to circumstances, finding ways to hold when holding seemed impossible. They held Bastogne for a week, then 2 weeks. German attacks came daily, tanks and infantry trying to break through understrength American positions defended by men who were cold, hungry, and running out of ammunition. But they held. Because that's what Curtis Cullen's innovation had really been about, Moore realized. Not the specific design of the Rhino modification, not the clever welding or the steel prongs. It was about refusing to accept that obstacles were permanent, about finding solutions when solutions seemed impossible, about ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things because the alternative was giving up. The weather cleared on December 23rd. American air power returned, and the Battle of the Bulge turned from desperate defense to grinding counterattack. The German offensive, their last great gamble, spent itself against American determination and material superiority. Just like Mortain, just like the Siegfried Line, just like the hedgerows. Different tactics, different terrain, same outcome. The war ended 5 months later. Germany surrendered, the armies went home. And the Rhino modification became a footnote in military history. An interesting innovation that had solved a specific problem in a specific place for a specific period of time. Most people forgot about it. The tankers who'd used it remembered, but even they rarely talked about it. Just another thing that had happened during the war. Another adaptation in a conflict that demanded constant adaptation. Curtis Cullen went back to his garage in New Jersey and lived a quiet life. He fixed cars, raised a family, and died peacefully in his sleep in 1963. The Medal of Honor nomination was never processed. The War Department film with the misspelled credits was archived and forgotten. But in Normandy, the gaps in the hedgerows remained. Physical evidence of a moment when a sergeant with a welder had changed the course of a campaign by refusing to accept that obstacles were permanent. Years later, a military historian would write about the Rhino tanks, analyzing their tactical significance and strategic impact. The analysis would be thorough, well-researched, and completely miss the point. Because the Rhino modification wasn't really about tanks or tactics. It was about the human capacity for innovation under pressure, about soldiers who looked at impossible problems and found solutions using whatever materials were at hand. About the idea that warfare belonged not just to generals planning campaigns, but to sergeants with welding torches who saw obstacles differently. That was the real innovation. Not the steel prongs or the Dozer blade. The mindset that created them. The refusal to accept defeat. The determination to adapt. The belief that every problem had a solution if you thought hard enough and were willing to try something new. Curtis Cullen invented that mindset just as much as he invented the modification. And unlike the steel prongs, which rusted away in French fields, the mindset survived. Passed from crew to crew, unit to unit, war to war. The understanding that obstacles exist only until someone figures out how to overcome them. The hedgerows of Normandy stand today much as they stood in 1944. Ancient boundaries that have outlasted empires and ideologies. Here and there, gaps mark them, places where American tanks once cut through on their way to victory. The metal is gone. The men are gone. The specific problems they solved are gone. But the lesson remains, written in earth and memory. Preserved in the spaces between obstacles, in the gaps that show where something unstoppable once passed through something that seemed impenetrable. War is solved not by the biggest weapons but by the clearest thinking. Victory comes not to the strongest armies but to the most adaptable ones. And sometimes the difference between triumph and disaster is one sergeant, one innovation, one refusal to accept that the current way is the only way. Curtis Cullen bolted a Dozer blade to a Sherman tank in 12 hours using German scrap metal and a welding torch. That modification changed a campaign, helped win a war, and demonstrated a truth that outlasted both. Obstacles are temporary. Innovation is eternal. And the human capacity to adapt under pressure is the most powerful weapon any army has ever fielded. The hedgerows remember, the earth remembers, and we remember, or should, that greatness sometimes comes not from generals or politicians, but from ordinary men who refuse to accept that impossible problems require impossible solutions. Sometimes all you need is a welder, some scrap metal, and the conviction that there must be a better way. If this story of innovation and adaptation resonated with you, if these accounts of soldiers thinking their way through impossible problems moved you, honor their memory by leaving a like, sharing your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribing so more stories like this can be told. These histories deserve to be remembered. These lessons deserve to be learned. And these soldiers, the ones who welded solutions from desperation, deserve to be known not just as statistics, but as individuals who changed the world by refusing to accept that change was impossible. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the fortifications of Germany. From one desperate innovation to 1,000 small adaptations. This is how wars are won. Not by overwhelming force alone, but by the capacity to think, to adapt, to overcome. Remember them. Remember what they did. Remember that obstacles exist only until someone clever enough and desperate enough figures out how to eliminate them.